Right, I think we are live, which is pretty
Perfect.
good. Fantastic. So I'm going to now just try and, am I spotlighted? Excellent. Good. Welcome everybody to a wonderful evening, and thanks for joining in. I'm so excited, you can tell. It's amazing to have Cherie Blair, QC, with us this evening. And I've already established yesterday when we spoke, Cherie, that we're both Liverpool fans.
Yes, absolutely. Champions of England.
Champions of England. And in fact, I brought this to celebrate. Me and you can celebrate like this anyway. I've
Oh,
got my
very
Liverpool scarf
good. Excellent.
19 times.
My son has barely had his Liverpool shirt off or since it's happened. Um,
It's good. It's excellent. Been waiting 30 years. So we've already established that we're both huge Liverpool fans, which means we're not Man United fans. And I know that jokes don't tend to work on Zoom, but I have to just share this
he's
one with
going to try it
everybody.
anyway. That's a very typical rabbi thing to do, you realize.
Well, that's the typical thing about me. That there was once. Did you hear the one about the rabbi, the QC, and the Man U manager? The rabbi, the QC, and the Man United manager was stuck in the middle of nowhere, and it was pouring with rain, and it was freezing cold, and they managed to find in the middle of nowhere this farmhouse, and they knock on the door, and there's this farmer there, and he kindly lets them lodge for the evening. But the problem is there's only 2 beds, so someone has to volunteer to go and sleep in the barn. So the rabbi says, yeah, I'll go in the barn. So he goes off the barn, and the QC and the Man United manager tuck up into bed. And about 10 minutes later, there's a knock at the door. It's the rabbi. He says, there's a pig in the barn. Now, my religion does not permit me to spend the night under the roof with such an animal. So the QC says, okay, I'll go to the barn. You sleep, rabbi. So the rabbi goes to bed. Everyone tucks up. The QC goes to the barn. 10 minutes later, there's a knock at the door. It's the QC. The QC says, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that there is also a cow in the barn, and it doesn't befit someone of the law to spend the night with such an animal. So the Man United manager then says, well, I'm the only one left. I'll go and sleep in the barn. So the rabbi and the QC tuck up into bed. And the Man United manager goes to the barn. 10 minutes later, there's a knock at the door. It's the pig and the cow.
Oh, I shouldn't laugh at that. Really, that's terrible.
Yes. Well, very sorry. Very sorry, Cherie. But anyway, welcome everybody.
I happen to see that we've got another QC on the line because I see that Jeffrey Gruder is there.
Another one of our members here in Radlett.
You have a very interesting congregation.
Yes, indeed. We had our last interview was with David Panic, QC. So this is a trilogy. Now, I wanted to introduce by saying that thanks go to Jonathan Metlis for making this possible this evening. Thank you, Jonathan. Also, thank you to Joe, Rose, and Hannah Rubin, who work for the United Synagogue and have helped organize all the technical stuff for this evening. And with Cherie Blair with us tonight, it really is someone who needs no introduction, and I'm not going to attempt to. But I'd like to take us all on a journey and focus on Cherie's life, and specifically, since this is a rabbi interviewing, the role of faith in your life, Cherie. And we're going to get started. My parents were card-carrying members of the Labour Party when I was growing up in Reading, in the late 80s and 90s, and it was very, very Labour area. And I remember even my favorite band endorsed you and Tony at number 10, Oasis. And so this was it for me. That was it. And I remember, and I know that you were born in Lancashire, but Cherie, you grew up on Merseyside, hence Liverpool connection. And I know that we said yesterday, my grandfather was born and bred in Bootle. So it's great to have some more Liverpudlian blood.
Just down the road from literally two stops on the trains to between Bootle and Waterloo, where I was brought up, all along the Mersey.
Oh, Yeah, fantastic. And we know that you were in Liverpool and you had that connection. My first question really, Cherie, is what did Liverpool give you?
Well, my husband would say it turned me into a Bolshevik Scouser. But I think that's slightly unkind. I think Liverpool, I think there's something about port cities. You know, Liverpool has been a melting pot for many, many centuries because of its position as a port. And that came with bad things, like it grew rich on the slave trade for sure, but it also came with many good things. I mean, you know, it was also involved in the anti-slavery movement. It means that the population has always been open to people coming from elsewhere. It has the oldest Chinatown in Europe. My own great-grandmother came from County Court, like many others, you know, to Liverpool thinking they were going on to America, but ended up staying there. So I think, you know, my husband often talks about societies that are open or closed. I think Liverpool has always been pretty open to that extent. The other thing, and particularly for this audience, that Liverpool gave me was an amazing role model. As a young girl, I was brought up by my mum and my grandmother, and my grandmother was a great fan of Rose Heilbronn QC, who was the first woman QC. And she, of course, was a Jewish girl from Liverpool, and was Liverpool was very proud of Rose Heilbronn. And my grandma used to go and watch her in court. She was the first woman to be a QC. She's the first woman to defend somebody on a capital murder trial when there was still the death penalty. She was very unusual because there were so few women. She was even more unusual because she also had a daughter. And years later, her daughter, and Jeffrey will know this as well, of course, Rose Heilbronn Rose is the mother, but her daughter became a QC too. And I was very lucky. She asked me to write the introduction to the book about her mother and about how much influence her mother had on me, and thinking that if this girl from Liverpool could make it as a lawyer, then maybe I could too. So, you know, Liverpool gave me my first role model.
Fantastic. And I wanted to ask on that note that your parents were devout Roman Catholics.
Well, no, not actually. It's my father who was the Roman Catholic, and we were brought up with my grandmother, his mother. My mother, actually, her father was in the Salvation Army, and he was a miner in Derbyshire. Her own mother had died when she was 14, and my mum had to stop school and look after her father and her 10-year-old brother. And then when her father married again when she was 18, my mother literally left the house the day the new wife came in, went down to London because she wanted to be an actress. And then she met my father, and, you know, 9 months later along came Cherie. And so they took me up to, I was born in Bury, as you say, in Lancashire, because my dad was performing at that time in the Repertory Theatre there. And at 6 weeks old, they took me to his mother. And for a time, I was probably more my grandmother's fourth child than I was my parents' child, because my mum then went back off onto Repertory Theatre with my dad. And then she only came to live permanently with my grandmother and me when my sister was born.
Right.
So, but it was my grandmother who was the devout Roman Catholic. Her cousin was our parish priest. But my mother, you know, allowed us to be brought up Catholic. And my father, of course, though brought up a Catholic, it was, as most people, or some people will remember, became a sort of famous soap star. But he was also notorious for being, well, a womanizer and a drunk. Though he was also famous for being a big Labour Party supporter. So my father actually got to Downing Street well before I did, because rather like Noel Gallagher went to 10 Downing Street when Tony was Prime Minister, my dad went to 10 Downing Street during Harold Wilson's time. I think probably behaved equally as badly.
Because I don't know the veracity of this. I haven't researched it, but when I spoke to my parents yesterday after we spoke, as you know, my grandfather grew up in Bootle, and it's very well known in the family. And they told me that apparently your father, my dad's Tony, your husband's Tony, your father's Tony, my father Tony said that it was well known in the family that Tony Booth, your father, was once engaged to a girl called Edith Margarita, aka Rita, my great auntie, who was born in Liverpool. Who was born in Liverpool in 1932.
Ah, well, he was born, of course, in 1931. And as I say, he was a bit of a ladies' man. I mean, he abandoned my mum and my sister and I when I was 8, because that was the time that my first half-sister was born. But he ended up having 8 daughters from 5 different women. So, I mean, he was a character, and yet, despite all of that, you know, we had a good relationship. I was with him when he died, with his then wife, and I'm friendly with all my half sisters. So, but to a large extent, as I was growing up, because my uncle, my grandma's youngest child, was only 14 when I went to live there. It was almost sometimes as though my dad was more like my errant big brother than he was my dad, and my grandfather was more like my dad. You know?
Yeah. Wow. And it's amazing that you had such a great relationship with him, because, you know,
it had its ups and downs, but you know, almost because of my grandmother, really, because she adored her eldest son. So yeah, you know, I couldn't possibly let my grandma down by not making sure my dad was all right. And it just most of the time he was all right.
Yeah, and if you look at your own marriage and family life, it's very
slightly
stable.
More stable. Yeah, Tony and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary in March, under lockdown, unfortunately. All plans.
Mazel tov.
Yeah, all plans for big party out the window.
Well, I'm sure that it had an intimacy that normal life couldn't provide.
Yeah, it's true.
And you read law at London School of Economics? I
did.
How did that go down? What was that like in those days?
Oh, that was fun. The nuns were very, very upset that I was going to the LSE. You know, they thought I was going to a hotbed of radicalism. Obviously, because what had happened in 1968, but it was relatively tame in 1972 when I went. The biggest thing I remember about going down to the LSE was that it's in Portugal Street, and there's a theatre there. And whilst I was doing my first year law around the corner in Houghton Street, in Portugal Street, where the theatre was, a Peacock Theatre, my father was appearing naked on the stage every night in O Calcutta.
Fantastic.
Just past, and there would be nice, helpfully placed posters outside. So really, you know, from a very early age, I learned to take embarrassment in my stride.
There's no choice when that happens, I guess.
No.
I'm not sure what my
I didn't go and watch. I have no desire to go and watch O Calcutta. But, yeah.
Wow, fantastic. And therefore, I guess that inspired you to be driven in your own way. And after law school, you hit the bar. I
did, yes. I think that it's some, you know, and Jeffrey's here as well, and there's something of a performer in all advocates at least. You know, but I was very aware about how precarious the acting life was, and though I loved drama and everything, I wanted to do something that, you know, would actually earn some money for my family and pay my mum and grandma back for all the sacrifices they had to make in order that my sister and I got the education that neither of them did. You know, when I went to university, I was the first person in my family to go to university. My father had actually got a scholarship to a grammar school himself and was about to stay on at the sixth form when his own father, who was a merchant seaman, fell down the ship's hold, broke his pelvis, and my dad had to take work as well. So, you know, I was very conscious that at 18, when I went to university, I was the first person who at that age wasn't earning money and bringing money into the family. So I needed to make it work. And it turned out I was quite good at law, and, you know, I came top at the LSE, and then I came top of the bar finals. So everything seemed to be great.
Wow.
Except I learned that the reason Rose Heilbronn was so famous was because she was so unusual. And that actually back in 1976, when I was called to the bar, only 10% of the barrister's profession were female. And it was actually, you know, there were not many female role models to model yourself on, and quite difficult to be taken seriously. Particularly at that time, I was still only 21.
Did you feel that it was
Sure.
an unfriendly environment for a woman at that time? Was
No,
that just a feeling, or did you hear that prejudice?
Not unfriendly is the wrong word. It was just kind of like, you know, it's kind of like, really? Why are you here? Because I came top of the bar final, I had to give the speech on behalf of the students at Lincoln's Inn. And one of the famous benches of Lincoln's Inn is Lord Denning. Those of you who are older will have heard of Lord Denning. He was a very famous judge at the time. And, you know, introduced to him as the student, he did say to me, he said, oh, it's very good, you know, but the bar really isn't a place for a woman. Saying, you know, that was a good start. But somehow or other, I thought all these rules didn't apply to me.
Wow.
And somehow or other, I made it work.
It's incredible, because when I was studying law at UCL, Denning was like an idol.
Well, of course, he's my idol. It's a bit disappointing.
And but by that time, I was a class of 2000. The majority of undergraduates at Bentham House were female. So
no,
it just
for
shows.
Sure. For sure. My own daughter is a barrister. And when she went to first of all to King's College London to do law, and then, you know, I mean, 50%, over 50% were women. And, you know, these days, I don't think being a woman is an obstacle at the bar. I really don't think it is an obstacle in the way it certainly was in the past. What I do think, though, is a real problem, which is a problem that I had, is if you don't have any contacts, and particularly if you are, as I did, obviously, you know, I got a full grant. I actually got a grant to do my bar finals. I mean, I had no money, but I was able, because I did so well in the exams, I was able to support myself doing part-time law teaching. But these days, I think students, men or women, who don't have family money behind them, it's really hard for them to survive the debt that now young barristers have. So I don't think it's so much a problem whether you're a girl or a boy, but I do think it's a problem if you don't have some kind of resources to support you.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was in college, I had a job. I won't say which day of the week it was on because of my religious commitments now. But
right. Okay, we see you're a naughty boy, yeah?
I was a naughty boy, and I was pulling pints at
That's
Highbury.
even naughtier, yeah.
Yeah, at Highbury for half time at the Arsenal. So I can identify with what you're saying, the struggles of getting through financially as a student. But it wasn't just law that you went full pelt into. You also harnessed your energies into politics, because you were the Labour candidate in the 1983 general election.
I was a candidate in North Thanet, where I did keep my deposit, which was actually quite unusual. I think that was the worst election result Labour had ever had until Jeremy Corbyn came along, but we won't talk about him at the moment. But yeah, I've always been interested in politics. I mean, my father was interested in politics, and obviously because I was living with his mother, I mean, we would see him, and he introduced me to politics. And then, of course, it was one of the things that Tony and I met over, if you like, apart from being pupils together, having the same apprenticeship together, was the interest in politics and actually the interest in religion.
So you were both devoutly religious at that time together, as well as interested in politics?
I've never considered myself devoutly religious in that sense, because I think of all the nuns and things. I think they'd thought about laughing if they thought I was devoutly religious. But religious in the sense that I did observe, you know, which I suppose coming from where I didn't think that was particularly remarkable until you come to a place where people don't really observe. you know.
Yeah.
So, and Tony, funny enough, Tony didn't come from a very religious household, but he sort of got religion at university, and he was confirmed in the Church of England at 21. So unusually for me, I never really met anyone who was, certainly throughout university, who was, you know, I had boyfriends at school, but then I was at the Catholic girls' grammar school and the Catholic boys' grammar school. So, you know, we were all Catholic, if you like. But to meet some at university, I didn't meet anyone who ever talked about religion.
Yeah.
And then I don't know how it came about. I discovered that Tony was really interested in religion and religious ideas.
Yeah.
Which in turn I think plays into the political. You know, and that's why if you were a traditional, maybe Catholic, you might think I'm not that religious, because I do believe in a progressive form of Catholicism, if you like.
And so, do you think that your faith and your religious beliefs gave you that idealism? Because politics and law both involve that sense of purpose, a sense of mission, public service. Do you think that that came from a deeper spiritual source?
Well, I think everything comes from a deeper spiritual source, actually. But I think that it's just the way that I was brought up, and I mean, I'm talking to a religious community here, and I think there's quite a lot in common between their Catholic families and Jewish families, in the sense of the strong emphasis on the family, a strong emphasis in, you know, a family that prays together, stays together, and a feeling that you have to give to your community. So that was something that we did from children. I mean, I can remember, and God knows this is, you know, they don't do it now, but, you know, as a small child in primary school, we used to collect during Lent for the poor black babies, you know, in Africa, this sort of thing. You know, I mean, it was a very old-fashioned attitude, if you like, but it was still about giving back to the missions. You know, at school we did sponsored walk to raise for the hospital. I mean, it was just the sort of things that you did, that you had to give back because you were lucky.
I became religious at university, and from a completely secular background became a rabbi. And
God works in mysterious ways.
He certainly does. He certainly does. And I looking back now, do you feel, I mean, in the span of time, that Britain and the West has changed dramatically in terms of becoming increasingly secular? Have you seen that sort of transition in your lifetime, and now kind of a kind of life of faith is far less prevalent than it was when you were growing up and becoming a politician and a lawyer?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? Because I think once upon a time, lots of people, because of social pressures, if you like, would go to church. Whether they really wanted to, I'm not entirely sure. At least now, I suppose, if you do go, it probably is because you want to, not because there's a social pressure to do so. In some extent, that might mean it's more real. To that extent. I mean, I have two views about this, because I'm not in favor of a religious state. I'm absolutely in favor of the separation of church and state. I think that, you know, that if you have a criteria for citizenship, or that's based on a religion, then the minorities in your country, assuming that that's the majority religion, you know, become automatically then a second-class citizen. I don't believe that. I think the state has to, you know, as a human rights barrister, has to hold the line for all citizens and protect them all. But I do think that we lose something, even just in the sense of, you know, I'm surprised these days how many children don't know the stories from the Bible. Again, the Catholic faith believes in the Old and the New Testament. So I know a lot of Old Testament stories as well as the New Testament. You know, whatever it is, King David or Samson or Ruth or whatever. And yet so many of our children today, you know, which I got at school, they don't get that at school, which is why, you know, my children went to Catholic schools, and I do believe in a system whereby people of faith can have state education, but which also reflects their faith. So something I'm interested in now with grandchildren of my own. You know, I very much want them to be brought up in that tradition.
Yeah. And do your
but it's
children?
Not my. That's up to their children. They've all been baptized, mind you. So far so good.
Okay. So that strong faith and that passion for a quest and a sense of purpose and responsibility for your community, obviously that took you to the heights that only some of us can imagine in terms of moving into number 10.
Well, it took my husband, and I came along for the ride.
Well, you both took up residency, I guess.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the funny thing is, when I was 14, I told the girls in my class that I was going to be the first British female prime minister. And I didn't make it, but I did make it to live in 10 Downing Street.
Indeed. And when you got there, I mean, there must have been, I imagine, many different challenges, highs and lows, vitriol launched against politicians, especially people at the top, and also tremendous successes in terms of victories that you had. But I was wanting to ask, as a rabbi speaking to a Catholic, how did...
This is like did a joke again, isn't it?
We walked into the bar that time in Whitehall. And my question would be, like, how did your faith inform your role? How, you know, were there times where you turned to God, or you had to...
I think so, absolutely. And there were little vignettes, if it's like, I mean, when Tony had his operation, you know, I was down there with my rosary beads, I'm afraid. You know, it's funny how these basic things come out. And I definitely remember the first time we went to the Vatican, and Tony was one of the first. It's been ages since a British Prime Minister had visited the Vatican, and we did an official visit to the Vatican. And, you know, you parade, you've got the Swiss Guards, and I was completely in black because that's the thing, and our children were with us, and we walked to see Pope John Paul. And as I was walking down the corridors of the Vatican, I could hear my grandma in my head saying to her cousin, who was the parish priest, well, you know, you may, you know, your side of the family, you may have got these priests, but our Cherie, she got to meet the Pope.
Wow. And so did you find in those years that your faith was tested and you had to draw on well springs of faith, and in terms of a relationship with a higher power or God, did that help you through those years and those challenges?
I think my faith was more tested in the British press than anything else, to be honest. I didn't blame God for that either. Just the you know, I wasn't really prepared for the relentless focus, particularly on the personal side of our lives, you know, which usually I think really hasn't really got a huge amount to do with how Tony does the job, but there was a lot of interest. I think partly because I was the first I was the first spouse of a prime minister to actually have a university degree, not because the previous spouses, you know, probably could have had a university degree, but just because of their ages and the time women didn't have those opportunities, or the women who did were quite, you know, strange or exceptional, or they didn't get married. And the fact that I continue with my full-time work as a QC led to a lot of interest, if you like, which I hadn't anticipated. And I always found quite strange, because by this time, you know, the assumption that as an educated woman in my 40s that I wouldn't want to work, that I wouldn't be working, didn't actually reflect the reality of society outside. And yet there was a lot of sort of, you know, you're going to continue working and your husband's prime minister. So that was an interesting struggle. And I'm so glad I did, because you can be so encompassed by what's going on in number 10. It's a real goldfish bowl and things are happening. And, you know, if I'd not had my own job and my own things to do, you know, I think you could have been really drawn into it in a way which would be improper, because I think if you want to do politics, you get yourself elected. You don't do politics because you happen to be married to the prime minister.
Yeah.
The fact that I had my own career, the fact that I went out to court, met people, I think it helped keep my perspective.
Do you think that your legal pursuits and your career therefore made it a softer landing pad when that term, when the time in number 10 came to an end, that you had an independent life anyway? So for you, apart from what your husband was doing, it wasn't a massive change for you in terms of your career?
Well, in some ways it was a change in my career, because actually that was around that time my career started to pivot into a different area of work, which is the area of work I do now, which is the international stuff. I mean, if you'd asked me in the 80s, before, you know, my ambition would have been to become a judge, you know, and to make my way up that 10 years at Downing Street. You know, I couldn't be a judge when my husband was prime minister. And by the time he stopped being prime minister, that time had almost passed, really. And I was also more interested in the other things that I could do, because I'd learned so much. Obviously, I knew a lot about the law, but I'd also, by this time, also learned so much about other things, about other countries, about diplomacy, about policy. And so, you know, suddenly then I wanted to do something that used all that knowledge I had in a slightly different way. And that's why, first of all, I wrote the book. I wrote my book, Speaking for Myself, which was like a big download and of giving myself a sense of perspective, that those 10 years in Downing Street were only part of a much longer journey, a journey which reflected that my good luck of being born a woman where I was in, you know, Western Europe, at a time when opportunities for girls were opening up to fulfill their potential. And I was lucky enough to be able to do that. And the fact that I had the Downing Street thing on top of that was only just one part of that. And then at the same time, I was thinking about what else I could do. And that's when I set up my foundation in 2008, which works in lower middle income countries with women entrepreneurs, because barristers are, to some extent, well, they're small businesses, you know, small businesses, part of possibly a bigger machine of chambers, but nevertheless, you know, if you don't work, you don't eat. And so I wanted to do something, because I realized through my travels that there were women who wanted to get that freedom that I had through having my own financial independence, but whose positions in their countries were either, if they were lucky, like they were in my country in 1970, when it was still kind of like, well, okay, you can work, but do you really want to? Or when you should do, you know, let's do something that's more suitable for a girl. And in some countries, it goes more like, for my mum and my grandmother, where basically, you know, girls didn't get those education opportunities and were not taken seriously at work at all. I mean, my poor mother obviously had to go out to work, and she managed, not having had an education, eventually she got into the travel industry and ended up managing a travel bureau in Oxford, in fact, part of the Sears group, and Selfridges there. But she spent many, many years training young men coming through that business, and seeing them all get the promotions and not her. She tried from time to time to see if she could get a mortgage so she didn't have to live with her mother-in-law. You know, and at that time, the banks would say, well, unless your husband signs you, because my parents didn't get divorced until I was 23.
Mm.
At the time when my father left my mother, we didn't even have the Divorce Law Reform Act. That was in 1963 he left. I mean, a divorce in a Catholic community in Liverpool, when your grandma's cousin was the parish priest. I mean, it was scandalous, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, when my mum tried to get a mortgage, you know, the bank said, well, you can't unless your husband signs the papers. Which, you know, but this still happens, by the way. This absolutely happens in places in Africa and in places in Asia. So I thought that what I'd learned in my journey, and particularly the work I'd done in sex discrimination and things, and the way I'd learned through my own experiences about what works and what doesn't work for women in the workforce, that, you know, we could do something to help women so that doesn't take the 30 years it had taken, or the 40 years it's taken to get from 1970 to then 2008. We could accelerate that process and particularly use technology to bring the kind of skills that women needed to run their businesses, to give them the opportunity for networks and mentoring, which can make all the difference between success and failure. And so the foundation has been operating since 2008, and we've reached 160,000 women entrepreneurs in over 100 countries using technology.
Incredible.
And this year we launched our 100,000 women campaign. We want in the next 3 years to raise £10 million to reach another 100,000 women. And funnily enough, in some ways, the COVID crisis has been it's played to our strengths. So the foundation are working from home, but because our programs are about using technology, we deliver many of our programs over the internet. We deliver them on mobile phones. And so we have made more of our programs available. We've opened new projects. We've just done a course about resilience for women entrepreneurs, which we did with Cambridge Wireless and King's College London. It's a course that women can take that ends up with them having a 90-day plan for how can I get through this crisis, because so many parts of the world, COVID-19, yes, it is a health issue, but it's also very, very much an economic issue. Very much an economic issue.
Yeah.
And women are disadvantaged in that anyway, and this is just, you know, doubled that disadvantage really. So all of that. And then after that, I decided that I would set up my own law firm. So I've done that too. So now I practice in international disputes and business rights. So, you know, we reinvent ourselves the whole time.
Wow.
Which is the great thing about being a lawyer, actually.
I remember Christopher Hitchens, the late, great Christopher Hitchens, once, I think he saw the increased emancipation of women as pivotal for society generally, that not only this kind of liberation of women in those societies could be great for them, but he saw it as actually a positive influence for the whole of society. Do you see that?
Absolutely. Look, you know, assumptions, we're all different, men and women. Not all women are not all the same, and men are not all the same. And yet, to some extent, for too long, we've been compartmentalized in, women, they're the carers, they're in the home. You know, men, they're not interested in caring. You know, their job is just to go out and make the money. And, you know, those assumptions are as unfair for men in some ways as they are for women. And, you know, the fact that more and more research shows that it's like in a family, you know, diversity and men and women working together produce better outcomes than them working in two separate silos. And so, I mean, I do think that, I mean, there's been all this joking about Tony not doing the housework. Where, and, you know, to be fair, obviously, you know, I'm a QC, so I'm not down on my knees scrubbing the floors most days either. But nevertheless, organizing things. Yeah. The buck stops with me, I suppose, at the end of the day, even if the buck may have passed through several hands before it gets to me. But, you know, I see it in my own sons. My husband, I was very lucky in one way, because when Tony became an MP, his income went down below mine, which before that, because he was doing more commercial work, it was more than that. So I became the main breadwinner, if you like. So there was a it wasn't really a choice not to go back to work. We needed to do that. But it did also mean when he was in the backbench MP in opposition that, he could spend time with the kids. And I always remember in the 1980s, one of the whips, the Labour whip from the Northeast, saying to him, Tony, you're never going to get anywhere in politics if you keep going back home after 7 o'clock, after the 7 o'clock vote, and then only come in at 10 o'clock to vote, So
Yeah.
he was wrong about that, of course. But, I see he did do a lot with his kids, but not a great deal with the housework. But, I see now my son is with us. 2 of my sons are with us, but Leo at 20 and at Oxford is I wouldn't describe him as a great housework person either, but my son is a very hands-on father, and he does help out, and he's certainly he once a week will cook the meal. I mean, his wife also, by the way, she cooks as well, but we're and I think that there's a freedom in that for people to do what works for them, rather than to do what society expects you to do just because they've decided that this is what a real man or a real woman looks like.
There's a great irony in Judaism as well. There's a counterintuitive or countercultural pattern or setup amongst very religious couples. When I got married, I was studying full-time in a Talmudical college. Which meant that
your wife
my wife was working, and indeed all my colleagues in the yeshiva, which is this college, their wives were working. So they were the lionesses providing for the home, and we were in full-time study.
No, I absolutely know that, because obviously when I set up the foundation, Tony was the quartet representative, and so we did work, and we worked both in Ramallah and Nablus, and in Jerusalem, and in Tel Aviv, and up in Western Galilee, with groups there. And one of the groups we did a project with was with the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem. And I went there, and we were providing business training for these often very young women with 7 or 8 kids, and we're trying to support the family, whether it was through baking or childcare for others, and we were providing training, and some, it was a successful program. Some of them, we did have some women applying, and their rabbis wouldn't allow them to use the internet, so then that wouldn't work with those programs, but many of them did. I can remember one woman had this great patisserie business. She was from France originally, and she in the old city of Jerusalem. And we were doing business training, business skills, so that she wasn't just a good cook, but she could make that good cooking work as a business. Because there are 2 things here when you have a business. You've got to be good at what you do, but you also need the business skills. And for many people, 2 things don't, business skills, how you work out profit and loss and things, are not necessarily instinctive in the way, really good baking probably is instinctive. I think some people just have that gift. We can all bake with following the recipes and things, but some people are just really good at it. But if you can't, on top of that, know how to price your cakes, then you're not going to necessarily make a profit. So I'm very aware of that. I was patron. I still am patron of something called Norwood, which is a Jewish charity in North London. Started around Golders Green. Now it's actually coming up more towards you. And they work with both disabled children and disadvantaged children. And they had a scheme up in Lordship Park, which we lived in Islington, so I know where that is. And they was Stamford Hill, exactly, and working. I remember going and visiting that, and seeing the young women there, because of course they did not finish their they weren't going to university. They were getting married, and and expecting to support their children. And I remember one of the things that Norwell was doing was making sure that they had dentistry and things like that, because a lot of them had very bad teeth because they were poor and didn't go to the dentist and things, you know. So I'm very aware of that question, though, that within the ultra-Orthodox community. I mean, it's not that it's still the minority among the Jewish community, of course, but nevertheless, yeah.
Well, it looks like that is a big part of the future of the Jewish people because of the birth rates and the cultural preservation, as it were. So in Israel, for example, they're expecting the Orthodox to form not only a significant minority, but based on mathematical projections, it will be the majority. And that
well, I
way,
think that always depends, and it was very interesting talking there and going and meeting it, you know, and there are some movements even within that to understand that wasting the resources of, you know, that women should have more education, that maybe things could change, and talking, I mean, then obviously I've talked to some women who had been brought up ultra-Orthodox and had then left that community. So, you know, things do change, I think.
and talking of Islington and talking about the Labour Party, obviously in late 2019, things came to a head with the general election, but the previous 5 years or so had caused our community great fear.
No, absolutely. It's absolutely completely. I joined the Jewish Labour movement, not because I'm, you know, because they said people who were not Jewish could join it if they wanted to show solidarity. So, I mean, I have no time at all for what happened, and I'm just grateful that it's no longer like that, and that Keir Starmer has shown quite clearly that it's not going to be like that in the future, because it should never have been like that in the first place.
Do you think he was held back from speaking his mind over the last 5 years?
I don't know, because I don't know him that well. I mean, I know him a bit, but I know him a bit because of the law rather than anything else. It certainly wouldn't have been his, given his background as a lawyer. I mean, I can't believe he ever thought this was a good idea. I mean, there is something very strange about the far left and their obsession almost with this alleged Jewish conspiracy, you know, that doesn't exist in the world actually, but in their heads it exists. You know.
Do you think that's something that will remain in the momentum side of Labour, or is it something that has had its day?
Personally, I would hope that there isn't a momentum side of Labour, and nothing would please me more if Richard Bergen or Jeremy Corbyn actually set up their own party. That's not what the Labour Party is all about, actually. But anyway, God, I'm probably going to be expelled tomorrow.
Okay, fine.
No, I won't be. But I mean, you know, I'm assuming I'm among friends, and yeah, I've got so many friends, you know, and obviously Tony and I we still are very close to Gilda and Michael Levy, you know, he is chair of Jewish Care. We would go to all those events. As you know, Tony has very good relationships in Israel. I mean, it's just, I just can't understand it at all. I really can't. It's, yeah.
Yeah, we've seen this pattern throughout history.
No, of course, absolutely. No, absolutely, and it's interesting.
I remember I came from a non-Jewish background myself, and and I guess on the Jewish road to Damascus when I was at university, I put one of these on my head, and when I put one of these on my head,
you made yourself different. Yeah.
My life changed. I got spat at, and I got stared at, and I got stamped on, and I can see it from both angles, because I came from without, and then suddenly I took on that identity, which is my mother's faith background, and it's just something that it's something that we've seen, and thank God for the vast majority of us, Lord Panic was actually saying that he hadn't experienced much anti-Semitism at all. But it's something that obviously caused great fear. But it is so comforting to know that there are people out there, you've spoken, and other people that can see this for what it is, and are dedicated to.
But it's interesting for me because, you know, when I was growing up in the 60s and things, it was still kind of, you know, being a Catholic was pretty much a minority thing, you know, and even when Tony became leader of the opposition and when we first went into Downing Street, I mean, according to Ian Paisley, you know, Tony wasn't fit to be prime minister because his wife was the Pope's Jezebel or something, because I was a Catholic. I mean, I can't remember what he said. It was something ridiculous, but you know,
Thatcher.
yeah, but you know, once upon a time, being a Catholic in this country was not a, you know, again, you couldn't be Lord Chancellor at one time, or married into the royal family, and all the things you couldn't be as a Jew either, by the way. But or at once, you know, these things changed over time with. So I understand that nowadays, of course, you just don't really find that anti-Catholicism stuff, which is interesting. Though I think you're right, to some extent, people do think you're a bit peculiar if you have a religious faith.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I feel the sense of camaraderie.
that they don't really distinguish between what the faith is, I think.
Yes, there's a great divide, secular and religious, in that sense. It is less marked than in the Middle East, for example, in Israel, where society is more polarized upon those lines. But there is, I definitely sense amongst interfaith work, a great sense of camaraderie with co-religious, you know, with other religious people, because it's a community of faith, which has also become a kind of almost like a minority group.
For sure. I mean, with Gilda Levy, I'm patron of something called the Women Interfaith Network, and that's actually the three Abrahamic faiths together, and they've produced some great stuff. They're doing quite a lot of stuff now with films, and there's a wonderful film they do where it's about the red, that one group are red and one group are blue skins, you know, and how they fall out, and then how the children bring them together. I mean. These things are important, and they're always there. People are always. It's so easy for people to retreat into their tribalism, and that's one of the worries in the world today, isn't it? We have to keep open to each other, not closed.
Yes.
Unfortunately, there are forces in the world that are only too keen to try and point out what divides us rather than what unites us.
And in terms of your foundation, have you seen that as a unifying force? That if you can give that sense of dynamic entrepreneurial passion to women and to other groups, that that kind of division and tribalism might somehow be ameliorated or diminished in some way?
Well, I do remember going back to the work the projects we've done in Israel, the work we did with Western Galilee College, which is, well, it is obviously it speaks for itself where it is, and we worked there with they did a course on women's entrepreneurship. It was a part-time course that people could come to, and we were very careful that we had equal. So there were obviously Jewish women there, often from immigrant groups, you know, and then we had obviously Druze in that area, and then the non-Druze Arabs, Muslim, Christian, all coming together. And for some of them, I went one time to give out. We got some computers for them to work and gave them out, and their families came. And it was the first time some of these families had ever been in the same room as someone of the other community.
Yeah.
And I always remember there were two women there whose businesses were basically head coverings. One was a Druze from the Druze community, D-R-U-S-E.
D-R, yeah.
And they cover their heads, so she was making head coverings, and that was her selling. And of course, the other was from an Orthodox Jewish community. And these two women actually were basically doing the same business. Slightly different head coverings, but nevertheless, the same business, and they became they're very good friends over it.
Incredible.
But they wouldn't necessarily have come together. But I suppose you're more conscious of that in Israel. The work we do in Nigeria and Kenya or Indonesia, there's not so much. I haven't so much. What religion you are doesn't really come into it. Though, of course, as you know, in Nigeria, there's a large Muslim population, you know, and the Christian population, and we work in. But you know, it's not so much of an issue as it was with the work we did in Israel.
We've already come on to an hour.
Yes.
No. So it's just flashed by, and there are some questions that I'm sure people would want to ask you, Cherie. And so if people can think about those questions and type them into the chat bar, I'll be able to select them. And if that's okay with you, Cherie, I'd like to take some questions for you.
Okay. Yep. Not too long, otherwise my husband's going to, you know, get upset.
Indeed, and my wife. I can tell you, and just to tell people, thank you before we get to questions. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. This has been an event by US in the City, United Synagogue in the City, which I've been running for the last 5, 6, 7 years, where we give lunch and learns and educational programs, usually in the city, the West End, Canary Wharf, and people's offices. And now we've gone online during lockdown. And so it's a pleasure to be part of this, and we're always looking for support and patrons for what we do. So if anyone's out there would like to be involved and help us carry on doing this kind of outreach work and interfaith work and trying to inspire in our community, that would be fantastic. I've got a question, first question for Cherie. This is from our friend Jonathan, who says that women's rights and minority rights are at the top of the current social agenda in the news. How can greater equality of opportunity be achieved, he says, without necessarily affirmative action or that type of intervention? And are things really that bad right now?
Well, I think it depends in one sense. I mean, I've already said a little bit about how I think that certainly in the legal profession, the problem isn't so much whether you're a woman or not, but it certainly is about your financial resources. And I think there still is a problem in the legal profession in relation to that affects equally minority ethnic groups as well. There's nothing wrong with affirmative action in leveling the playing field. It's not the same, you know, you shouldn't have asked a discrimination lawyer. I'm sure David Panic would also be able to tell you this, you know, but positive discrimination wrong, affirmative action to try and level up the playing field is actually completely and utterly acceptable. But I think I've been thinking about this, obviously, because all this Black Lives Matter stuff, and it's been slightly strange in one way, because obviously with all the work I've done with women, you know, we've always tended to be, we're not a minority, by the way, but, you know, we've tended to be the people who've been discriminated against. And with the Black Lives Matter thing, you know, it just makes you think, actually, in this case, I am not the minority, you know, and I need to understand, just like I would say in relation to women who've been harassed or discriminated against. It's not good enough to say, I didn't mean to hurt you, because if you have hurt me, you know, then that's the reality you have to acknowledge. And so I think that when we look at what's been happening, I think the first thing we have to do is accept that there have been these disadvantages, that there have been things going on which people, nothing to do with their merits at all, but because of their either gender or in this case their appearance, have not been treated in the same way as someone who doesn't look like that. And then I think the next thing we also have to do is acknowledge that something that's quite uncomfortable, that actually maybe I have in some ways been benefited because I'm white. And, you know, and that's quite difficult because often I'm always talking about, as a woman, we experience this, that, and the other. But, you know, I'm also a white woman, and there may well have been black men and women who have felt that I've had the advantages just because of that. And I think we have to recognize that too. So it can be quite uncomfortable to do that. And then I think we just have to act together to make sure that we try and do as much as we can to build a society where we really do judge people, not on the assumptions we make because of the way they look, but on the skills and the things that they bring to the table, and acknowledging that actually differences are good. Differences are creative. And we shouldn't, and we all are a bit frightened of differences, but if we can understand that that's where progress and creativity come from, and embrace differences, then we'll have a better society.
Another question, moving on, because time is of the essence. One question from Sandra: would Cherie like to see women having a more prominent role in the Catholic Church, as has happened in the C of E?
Well, as Jonathan knows, because when we talked yesterday, you revealed that you'd very kindly read one of the speeches that I'd made at the Vatican, where I actually make this point. You know, that in today's world, a curia, a Catholic face, which is always masculine, it doesn't reflect today's world, and that we should see and hear more women's voices. There are some amazing women in the Catholic Church. I was educated by some amazing nuns, you know, and there still are fewer nuns, but who do amazing things. And then there are Catholic laity, you know, who have a contribution to make. And unfortunately, in the past, the systems in the Vatican and the systems in the local churches have kind of been pat on the head, women, you know, but you know your place. And, you know, yet in fact, if you look at who keeps the churches going, I know this is also true in the Jewish religion too, you know, who is it that passes on the faith to the children? Who is it that goes in and makes things happen within the community? You know, the role that women play in that is often unacknowledged, and we're seeing that now in this crisis, actually in COVID. Suddenly, you know, everybody's much more aware about the amazing work that carers do, often mainly women, poorly paid, cleaners, people that we don't normally think of who are now essential workers, yet many of them are, you know, low paid and not acknowledged. And you know, it's something that we need to be. I think sometimes these things are regarded, caring is regarded as woman's work, and we don't value it. And I would really like to see, as a result of this COVID thing, that we did value it more.
Yes.
Not just in thank yous, but actually maybe even in better pay conditions. Another
question that's come in. Does Cherie have discussions about Israel-Palestine with Sister Lauren?
She's living in Turkey now, actually. Yeah. We don't really agree on this, I think. But you know, I do. She's my sister, my half sister, and so we do talk from time to time, and she occasionally will come out with something that, you know, I find unacceptable, and I will tell her I find it unacceptable. You know, yeah, but it's very strange because her grandmother, her mother's mother, was Jewish.
That means she's Jewish.
Yeah, I know. So I find it even more. I knew her grandparents a little. I think her grandmother must be turning in her grave.
Yeah, absolutely. We have,
And yet, she wasn't brought up religiously. Like, she had a very difficult childhood, and she has found through this faith that she has found a home and a sense of security and of herself. And that is, that faith is a good thing for that.
yes,
It's just the political side of that. We don't agree.
indeed, the first circumcision I ever experienced was not in the Jewish faith, but it was
Muslim faith.
in Turkish Cyprus.
Okay.
As a boy, we went there on holiday, and we got to know locals there, and we went along to a circumcision party for two boys that we became friends with, and so I didn't know that would that'd be part of my faith tradition going forward. But you never know.
No.
And on to a similar subject. Did Alistair Campbell? This is from Barry Shaw. Did Alistair Campbell's famous "We don't do God" have any effect on your views of the role of faith in politics and public life?
No, I was actually very irritated with him when he said that, because I actually knew that Tony did do God. He just didn't talk about it a lot. So it was all very well for Alistair to speak for Alistair, but actually it's not really true to say that. I mean, Tony didn't talk about it, or that he prayed. Absolutely. When he was in Downing Street, we went to church every week, not because we thought we should, but because we wanted to. That sort of thing is just the way you are. So we do God every day because God is part of our lives.
Yeah. And I've got another question here. I think this is the last one. Has the fact...
But I'm sounding very pious. I'm really not that pious, I promise you. It's your fault for asking these questions.
Well, that makes two of us. Has the fact that you are the former PM's wife helped or hindered your professional career?
Well, thank goodness, first of all, I once was introduced as the former wife of the Prime Minister by someone who got so at least you got that bit right. I mean, I think it's a strange thing, isn't it? Because I was appointed QC by the Tory Lord Chancellor before my husband became Prime Minister. I used to do a bit of government work then. As soon as my husband became Prime Minister, the one thing I couldn't do was work for the government, though I did take cases against him, including that one just before Leah was born, which was about the parental leave, where they had Blair versus Blair, because I was for the TUC, saying the government hadn't implemented the EU directive on parental leave properly. So in some ways, I mean, it certainly affected my career trajectory, because if he hadn't become Prime Minister, I'm sure I probably would have ended up a judge.
Yes.
It certainly affected his brother's career trajectory, because he also was not able to go to the bench, but he went straight to the bench once Tony ceased to be Prime Minister. On the other hand, it also gave me these amazing opportunities, not least recognition. People knew more who I was. It also gave me opportunities to go abroad, and I went to the Supreme Court in America, and I had lunch with the judges of the Supreme Court and talked to them. I gave speeches at Georgetown. I went to the Israeli Supreme Court. It's an amazing court. What an amazing building that is. The court. I mean, the symbolism of it all is amazing. I went to the Indian. I mean, these are not the sort of things that your ordinary barrister gets to do.
They go for an Indian.
But not to the Indian Supreme Court and the Pakistani Supreme Court and have dinner with the Chief Justice and things. So all of that is. My knowledge and my experiences and my understanding was really increased by that. My best story, of course, I think, is I am actually one of the few QCs who, on the day that it was announced I got silk, became a QC, was actually able to thank Her Majesty in person. Because traditionally the Queen has always had the leader of the opposition around to Windsor Castle, and you're supposed to stay overnight. Much to Tony and I's relief, because we had young kids. Because of the fire, we weren't able to stay overnight, but we did go to Windsor Castle. And the day we went, as it happened, was the night before, the Wednesday before the Maunday Thursday, that when we used to announce the Queen's Council list, and that was the list I was on. And the librarian at the Windsor Castle had got out from the library some stuff from Queen Victoria and others, all about different QCs and the process. I mean, you know, it was so kind, and I was so lucky.
In fact, we got a question saying, what was your highlight in number 10? I guess that's
one of them, but no, I think probably the Pope.
Being able to meet him.
Well, I mean, you know, in the end, I've met 3 popes. Who would know? Yeah. But you know, that was to go then, and then the Pope said a private mass for us, and we went into his private chapel, and we asked the seminarians from the English Welsh, the colleges where they train. So the seminarians from the English, Welsh, and well, the English and England, Wales, and Scottish seminaries came and attended that.
Amazing.
And,
I see you're getting
and sang and everything. So I mean, it was quite an extraordinary experience. And then to have a private look around the Sistine Chapel, you know,
wow.
and actually be able, you know, just Tony, me, and the kids, and the people who are with us from Downing Street. I mean, you know, it's extraordinary. But so many things. Went to the White House, and Stevie Wonder sang Ma Cherie Amour for me. I mean, you know.
Well.
All the amazing oh yeah, you're going to serenade me now, yeah. Oh, you know,
no.
Barbecues at Balmoral, where the Queen does the washing up, which is kind of like
unbelievable. It's been amazing. We're already an hour and 15 in. So
I know, and my nanny's just come and stared at me through the door.
Well, I just wanted to thank you,
She
Cherie.
puts me to bed, you know.
Oh yeah, of course. I've got my butler coming in a minute.
This is the thing, because we've got my grandchildren here, and our nanny, we help out with our 2 grandchildren. So our nanny has seamlessly become a nanny to our grandchildren now. Wow.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you, Cherie, for a fascinating talk, and for letting us in. You know, you were incredibly honest, and you let us right in.
It's one of my faults, yeah.
I love it. I love the openness, and I love that sense of the humanity and the grace that you bring. And I'm just very, very grateful that you gave us your time. And I know that there are many people tuning in on Facebook and on Zoom tonight that will agree. And we're very, very grateful for your time. Thank you for all the work you do, and thanks for sharing with us the work you do in your foundation, and sharing with us your whole story. I wonder what would have happened had my great aunt married your father. Who knows? Maybe I wouldn't have been born. But thank you so much, Cherie. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And have a very safe evening. And we'll catch you next time. And stay safe, everybody. And thank you very much, Cherie.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was lovely talking to you all. Thank you.
Good evening.